Today, we're going to open with a tale of two basketball teams that we have some personal connections to, Michigan and Houston. Now, both are in the top 6 of the Basketball Power Index. Both are national championship contenders, and both are off to rollicking starts. Let's start with Michigan. They're 7-0, and they just came off of 2 incredibly dominant wins. They beat 2 top 25 teams, Auburn and Gonzaga, by 30 and 40 points, respectively. Now, Houston is 7-1. They might not be steamrolling teams in the same way that Michigan is, but they are off to a great start. No one is arguing that either. Now, here's where things get interesting. These two teams, they have a very different blueprint for their success. Michigan is heavily reliant on players that they acquired from other teams via the transfer portal. 4 out of their 5 starters are transfers. That means they were not on the team last year. Houston, they've got 3 returning starters from their last year's powerhouse team, and the other 2 are freshmen. They're not transfers from other schools. These are kids that were recruited into the program. It's got us thinking about the role of talent acquisition versus talent development. And today we're going to try to answer one of the most important questions there is in the world of performance, and not just for NCAA basketball, but for all of us. Is talent something that you find? Is talent something that you're born with? Or is talent something that you build? This, my friends, is Excellence Actually. I'm Brad Stulberg, joined as always by Steve Magnus and Clay Skipper.
One thing Brad left out of his wonderful intro there is that Vanderbilt, my alma mater, also a top 20 basketball power index school and is 8-0, and will certainly be hanging up there with Houston and Michigan soon. That being said, let's get back to the topic at hand. Brad made a great point at the end there. We're talking about this using the framing of basketball, but obviously talent and all the things we're going to get into in this conversation has implications for all different domains, right? And, you know, we sort of framed it with this misleading question because it kind of reaffirms this false dichotomy that I think has come to describe our discussions about talent, which is nature versus nurture, talent acquisition versus talent development. But it's not nature or nurture. It's nature and nurture. It's nurturing nature. It's all these things. And so we're going to discuss that today. And instead of trying to figure out which one's right and which one's wrong, it's going to be more about how we should think differently about talent and how we should change the conversation around talent. So let's start here. Steve, you have a lot of experience, obviously, both acquiring talent and developing talent. Just big picture, what do you think are some of the things we get wrong when it comes to talking about talent?
Absolutely. Let's dig in. So I think first off is the binary that you mentioned there, Clay, nature versus nurture. We see it as a either or. When, like most things, it's a both and. It's context dependent. Everything freaking matters. So those who go around and say, hey, like just develop the culture, develop the athletes, they'll get better. I'm here to tell you that yes, that's true. But at the highest level, you need a baseline of talent. We need it, right? We cannot have a team, no offense, of Clay Skippers and Brad Stulbergs at the cross-country team for Houston or Vanderbilt or whoever. We're not going anywhere. Sorry, guys. No matter how good of a job I do as a coach, we've got to have some baseline talent. And that's, I think, number one, is it's not an either or. The other things that I think really matter that we get wrong here is we see talent as like this single kind of factor where say either you got it or you don't. Talent comes in many forms. Some is just the ability, it's that freak of nature, that prodigy who shows up and they're just really good at the thing. Other people's talent is literally in their progress. They have a longer road, a longer leash where they just keep getting better when they do things, and that talent doesn't show up until they actually train or go through skill development, and all of a sudden they're beating people who were better naturally, quote unquote, talented from the get-go. So it comes in many different forms. I think the other things where we kind of really mess up the talent development idea is we really kind of suck at predicting talent. We walk around with this idea of like, oh, I can identify the best 8-year-olds, the best 12-year-olds, even the best 18-year-olds. And it's not easy. And I'm coming from a sport that is as objective as you could freaking get. Did Johnny run faster than Jimmy or not? But even with that objective nature, you look at the best track or cross country teams, they're often not the ones who got the fastest, high school kids or the fastest transfers and put them all together. Because even in something super objective, predicting talent is really freaking hard. And to go along with that, predicting development is really freaking hard. All you have to do is look at the NFL draft, the NBA draft, the MLB draft, and see how often these people who get paid millions of dollars to get it right get it so wrong so many freaking times.
Yeah, I think the NFL one is a really good example here because this counterfactual I always have in my head is Patrick Mahomes. He has been in the league, I think, 8 years now, and he has been to the AFC Championship in every season. He's won, I believe, 3 Super Bowls and 2 MVPs, if not more. But anyway, I always think as a beleaguered Jets fan, I'm like, if Patrick Mahomes went to the New York Jets, I don't know if he's even close to Patrick Mahomes. I'm sure he would still be pretty good, but I think it matters a lot where you land. Patrick Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes because he has innate talent, certainly, but he's also Patrick Mahomes because he's in Andy Reid's offensive system, who is Andy Reid's arguably the greatest offensive coach of all time, right? And so I think it's an interesting entree into thinking about talent. And we'll get into more of this, but I think one big takeaway from today's episode is that we need to broaden how we think about talent. And maybe you can think of it as having 4 different components. One is capacity, and that could be like innate ability, what we usually label as talent, right? Just your inborn ability to do something. 2, I think, is opportunity. So that's like, what is the coaching you get, the resources you have to sort of harness that talent? And to bring this into something like academics, do you get put on a fast track as a young kid to be in a advanced math class or advanced English class, right? That's sort of opportunity meeting capacity. And then two other elements of this are fit and grit. Both these, I think, relate to motivation. So fit is like how intrinsically motivated and emotionally connected are you to your capacity. And then lastly, grit is like how much motivation and just straight grinding work ethic do you have? So that's capacity meets opportunity meets fit meets grit. That sort of, I think, composes talent in some ways. Do you guys think that's fair?
I think it's fair. I'd make one little addition, which is just to introduce like more complexity to this, which is you mentioned that if you've got capacity, which is what we're saying is innate genetics, and you get put on a fast track in math, that's opportunity. Maybe, but maybe not. Because if you got put on the fast track in math when you're 9 and you feel in above your head, then you're going to quit math. Whereas if maybe they waited till you were 11, that fast track in math was going to send you to MIT. So there's like a timing component too, of when are you mature enough to get on that fast track? Because we know that progress is nonlinear. Just like some people grow in their early teens and some people grow in their late teens, the same is true with cognition. You might be the most gifted person in the world for math, but you might not express that until age 10, whereas some 6-year-olds might have a huge expression of math talent at age 6, but then by age 10, everyone surpassed them. So it's really complex.
I love this framing and I love the complexity, even though it might confuse people because it's the reality of the situation. And I think the only other, not component, but caveat I throw into this is what is the pursuit or sport or endeavor like incentivizing? Because we have all these things and often I think we think like, oh, if you've got the talent and you get some coaching, like you're going to develop. But as you showed in the NFL example, I think you're spot on. I think if you take people to different environments, you have different results. And I think part of that is what are those environments or those endeavors like incentivizing? All of these different teams and organizations and sports and places are figuring out how to manipulate that complexity to give them an advantage given their individual situation. And some do it well enough, and some, throw the dice and get it wrong for their situation.
I want to come back to this notion real quick that talent is really complex, which it is. But I think at the individual level, it's also kind of simple. And what I mean by that is that if you have just terrible capacity for something, it doesn't matter how much you like it or how much work you put in, you are not going to be good. I could have practiced, what's Gladwell, 10,000 hours? I could have done 10 Gladwell books, 100,000 hours on the piano, and I never would have been a good piano player. I mean, to my dismay, my parents tried that, and I just stunk, okay? It's just my brain can't do it. I can't move both hands at the same time. I don't know how people can do it. I can't. However, I have pretty good capacity for sport. Not great, but pretty good. I'm 6 feet tall, not 5'1". I've got a ability to train hard and put on lean muscle mass. And I liked it. So I worked really hard, and I was a very good high school football player. Again, very good, 99 percentile. Now, top 1% means you're going to go play big D1 college football. I wasn't that. I didn't have the capacity. However, the one thing where I did have tons of capacity, and we talked about this a little bit offline, Clay, I think you're similar. I don't know about you, Steve, is my verbal intelligence was just off the charts. Like, my parents sent me to this crazy private school, which I ended up transferring out of because it sucked in first grade. But the only reason that I got in is because little first grade Brad scored 100% on all the verbal IQ tests that they're giving to little first graders. When I applied to college, my ACT score was a 29. You know what that 29 was combined of? 35 verbal and 23 math. Okay? Again, I wasn't going to be a scientist or a mathematician. I was going to be a writer. And the thing that I'm actually pro at isn't being an athlete. The thing I'm pro at is where I was innately gifted and I also liked it. So I think at the individual level, so much of it comes down to if you're going to suck at something, you're going to suck at it. If you've got moderate capacity and you really like it and you work hard, you're going to be Brad the power lifter. You're not going to be Steve the runner, but you're going to be very good. I mean, our mentor, Mike Joyner, who's studied this stuff for 70 years, has this saying that just about anyone with decent genetics can get to the 99th percentile of something, and just about no one can get to the 1 percentile, regardless of how hard you work. Then I think if you want to be pro at something, and especially if you want to be pro at something that's hard and good, that's where you need all these things to come together. That's how I see it at the individual level.
Yeah, I think there's one other thing that is here, and this is like maybe the murky middle between like you're good enough to be in the arena, but you don't know how good you can be. Is I think there is, how would I put this? I think when it comes to talent, there is talent that is basically, are you a grower or are you a shower? Meaning, think of it like this. Is some kids, they join the track team and they just are immediately really freaking good off of no training. You put them in the mile and you're just like, holy crap, you ran well.
They're a shower. You got to get them an OnlyFans account for their running.
Exactly. You have other kids who, if you take them off zero training and you put them out there and you're like, like there's some talent, but you're not thinking otherworldly. But then when you start adding on the training, all of a sudden they skyrocket, right? And they're a grower. They just, it comes out when they put in the work. And I've seen this time and time again. And I think the mistake we often make when it comes to talent, ID, and development is we are biased towards the showers, the people who do the PE mile test and like kill it. And then we say, oh, this is the most talented person. And we often miss the people who, if you just gave them a year of training, for whatever reason, their capacity blooms and grows, and you'd see their development. So I think we have to have like paths for each. And the takeaway for me is you never really know someone's talent until you give them enough time to mess around and see, can you play the piano after you've practiced? Like, you've got to do the thing to see if you're a grower.
I think this is why it's so important that we broaden our definition of talent and think really hard about who we apply the label to, because to go to your point, but also to what the point Brad was making about his sort of early verbal intelligence, people who get labeled talented at something at a young age often get filtered or funneled into situations that exacerbates that talent or highlights it, right? If you are told that you're a great writer and you get put in sort of advanced English as a second grader, well, you might have some innate talent, but also certainly from getting the advanced teaching, if you are ready for it, it's going to improve your writing. And whether or not you had innate talent, you're going to become better at it, probably. And that it creates a disadvantage for people who aren't put into those funnels. I also think if you're told you're good at something, then you have more confidence, and so you're more likely to try it, right? The flip of that jumps out to me that is maybe a negative goes into the growth and fixed mindset literature. Whereas if you're told you're talented at something, then maybe when you get to a level where you struggle, you start to, the failure might be a little bit more difficult to deal with, because if you think it's innate, then you think, oh, this is a failure of my personhood rather than this is a failure of, not applying myself, or maybe contextual factors that don't have anything to do with who I am as a person, but are just like, I didn't get a lucky break, right? So I can see how there are pros and cons in both, but I do think that's an important part of this conversation is like, how do we apply the label of talented? And then how does that label have downstream effects for people who get put into the talented category and people who are not in the talented category?
Well, I think this is coaching in parenting, in managing in the office 101. You might identify someone that is insanely talented, and that might affect your decision-making about what to do with them. But you don't tell that person that. You tell that person that they're working really hard and they're getting good because they're working hard. And you just beat that drum over and over again. Like, these are incredible results. Keep up the effort. Keep up the hard work. Keep practicing. You're only going to get better. And this is the crux of Carol Dweck's growth mindset, which is just that. Like, if you tell someone that you're really good, they develop a fixed mindset, which is, I was born this way and I can't change it. And when things go bad, I can't change it. And this is just who I am. And when you tell someone that you're good because you're practicing, well, then they develop the belief that they can influence how good they are based on the work they put in. And we know that while both matter, as we've been saying throughout this episode, there's a huge component of effort in work. Like, you can have the most talented person in the world, but if they don't do anything, they're not going to be good. So if you are someone that is a parent or a coach or a manager and you see someone that's wildly talented, it's not great to tell that person you're wildly talented. What you want to tell that person is like, I see a lot of potential, like, let's start working, and then reward the work, not praise this innate thing.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to something my wife taught me as teacher. Is she said, like, you have to be very careful about prejudging a kid. Meaning, like, whether the results of their IQ test or their standardized test is like really good or not so good, like, the moment you kind of assign that label and put that kid in a box, like, you've restricted their pathway forward, because you're saying, oh, you're on this pathway, this is what you're capable of, like, I'm going to treat you like that. And even subconsciously, there's research that shows, like, you'll change your coaching or your teaching to fit your expectation of that kid or that athlete. And I've seen it so many times in running, both with myself as a coach and other coaching friends, is where they'll just kind of say, oh, you know what? You weren't the star recruit and you were whatever, barely made the state meet. So we're going to put you in this group. And then they don't realize that kid or that athlete has so much more underneath there until like much later, right? And sometimes maybe even never, and that kid has to find another opportunity somewhere. And the last thing I'll say that kind of adds some complexity, but I think is important, is there is a time where you're going to want to tell that person, like, you can be great, right? You don't want to do it too early because that burdens them. But at some level, I'm thinking of athletes, maybe like a Brian Barraza, who I coach in college, of like letting them know, like, hey, your horizon, you're seeing it here, which, is maybe at 60%. I'm saying, hey, you can go 99%. But then you tie it back to the work and doing the things. But you're essentially saying, like, you're more talented than you think you are if we go on this journey. But it's like very tricky on when you kind of like show that or throw that out there.
We're talking about people who have innate talent, I guess, to use that phrase, or innate capacity, and not wanting them to rely on that innate ability such that they don't create the sort of foundational work ethic you need to capitalize on that ability. How do you think about the opposite side, with these people who are maybe not as talented or seem to have, again, I'm doing the thing we talked about at the beginning, not doing, which is applying the label of talent, right? But for instance, like, I'm curious, Steve, especially as someone who coached athletes, like, you want to instill confidence in the kids and their ability, right? Because so much of talent is work ethic and discipline and motivation. And yet there is the sort of natural reality of genetic constraints, right? So like, how do you instill faith and belief while also still helping them be aware of their limits?
Oh man. So
Simple question, right?
yeah. So to me, I think it's like giving them hope with a dose of reality. And what I mean by that is with basically every kid, I would sit down and be like, look, we all suck at predicting talent. Give them the NFL spiel. Like, I'm not making that much, so I can't predict things. I can't tell you how good you can be, but I can tell you how we can kind of find out where your potential lies. And whether your potential lies as, hey, I'm going to be a conference level distance runner or national level or be able to go pro, I can't tell you. But like, here's the things that you have to do to go on this journey to find out. And I think what you do in that case, especially if you have someone who isn't the shower with a lot of talent there, is you give them hope. You give them examples of other people who, hey, this young lady came in having never qualified for the state meet, and she was a national qualifier. Could I have predicted that at the beginning? No. In fact, in my head, I was thinking, oh, I don't know if this girl will survive this team for 4 years. But she did, and she made it. And I couldn't have predicted that. So you give them examples that show of hope of what can happen. Well, at the same time, I think also keeping a bit of perspective of like, I'm not promising you this. I'm not telling you that you're going to achieve your wildest dreams. Like, there are going to be people with more talent than you who might not work as hard as you and still run faster. And you kind of say, like, this is the reality of sport, but more so, this is the reality of pursuing anything in life where you're going to have to come face to face with, like, are you good enough or not? And that can be really hard, but it's also the freaking point, because it's much easier to just kind of play it safe and be like, the Al Bundys of the world of like, I scored 3 touchdowns in high school football, and if I didn't get hurt, I would have been a superstar, right? You tell yourself that story when you're just kind of like self-protecting. So to me, it's like setting them up to go on a journey of like, let's see if we can confront our limits. And if they're not what we wanted, like, great, we went on the journey to discover it.
I think in the case of a college athlete, especially at the D1 level, like, the range is already restricted pretty good though. Like, you're not getting a 27-minute 5K-er. So I think that there's also like the second component, which is I do actually think that it at a certain point you can kind of say like, all right, like, you got a shot or you don't. And then for the people that got a shot, like, once you get into that top 5%, then you don't know unless you try and find out. And this kind of gets back to the importance of innate capacity. Like, you're not going to take a 27-minute 5K and make her a 17-minute 5K, probably not, at least. But you might take a 21-minute or a 20-minute 5K and make her a 17-minute 5K. So I think that, like, there's this second question about restricting the range. So it's like, are you, we said this earlier, are you good enough to kind of get in the arena? And that's like level 1. And then once you're in the arena, yeah, you might have some like odds and biases based on where you start, but where you start doesn't always predict where you finish.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and that's right. And I think what it also gets to is the point of sport. Like, this is a whole nother conversation, but as a coach with that 27-minute 5K runner, like, you're framing it as the point of sport. You're not framing it as like, oh, we're going to go D1, blah, blah,
Right.
blah. It's like, hey, if you enjoy this, great. But you're also bringing in that reality of like, hey, this isn't that likely. So, but it's fine. Like, it's good to still pursue things if you enjoy pursuing it.
I think that you get that a lot more in sport than in other fields because it is so objective. Like, I can't tell some people, and believe you me, I wish I could, like, your writing is just never going to get there. So you're probably not going to be a pro. It's harder with more intellectual pursuits, I think. And And there's some pretty good research that shows that, like, even on the intellectual side, somewhere between 40 to 60% of how good you're going to be is just inherited. It's like the lot that you're dealt. Most people have some seeds in there that if they water, they're going to grow. That's where the fit comes in. You just have to sample until you find those things. And if I would have butt my head at piano and math, I wouldn't be a decent athlete and a pro writer. But I didn't do that. And I think this is where, like, the parenting approach of you need to be a doctor, or you need to play classical music because that's what all the rich kids are doing, or that's what I read in some book, is just so utterly terrible. It ought to be like, you should try a whole bunch of things, and then you're going to figure out what you like and what you're good at. And most young people like things that they're good at. Like, very rarely do you get someone that just sucks at piano and they're like, I want to spend 30 hours a week playing piano. It doesn't work like that.
This gets into a sort of larger philosophical debate that I don't think we have the capacity nor time to answer today. But there is something interesting here about like competition, right? I think especially in our society, we're sort of, I'm thinking specifically of school. Like, sports is obviously you're competing, and it's objective. You win or you lose. There's a scoreboard, right? But I think in school too, we're very obsessed with like ranking, and we make it so competitive, especially at a young age. And there are benefits to that. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, but I think that competitiveness and the importance of like being the best and going to the best school and having the highest scores, it creates this natural sorting system where people get listed as talented or not talented. And I think that can be really limiting for people who maybe get listed as not talented at a young age, right? And so it's just like, how do we keep the good parts of competition but not allow it to create a system that is letting people who might have unnoticed talents fall through the cracks, right, or fall behind?
I think this is what our system does poorly, is we miss the late bloomers. We miss the ones, contrasting your story, Brad, is like you had the early verbal intelligence stuff. I have no idea what I scored on my kindergarten IQ test, but like on the admissions SAT or whatever, I was pretty much down the middle of like pretty solid in math, science, and English verbal stuff. Like, nothing was crazy. And if you ask like my high school essay writing, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, Steve does pretty well," right? But it really didn't like flourish on the writing until I started writing about things that I was interested in, aka running and performance, versus trying to write about A Tale of Two Cities or whatever the fiction book that we all know I didn't read. So, like, to me, I think when we go through this sorting process is sometimes we miss out on those athletes or those individuals who might find that fit, but find that fit a little bit later. And I think that does a disservice. So I think in an ideal world, you have paths for both. And I think this is where sport kind of does an okay job. So if we take running, for example, all right, maybe all the phenoms and the people who show talent, they all go D1. But that kid who loves running, who came to it a little bit later, maybe they go D2 or D3. And they're not after the scholarship, they just love it. And then they end up turning into maybe someone like a Dakota Lindworm who made an Olympic team in the marathon after being, someone who couldn't come close to walking on a D1 team. But she was able to, go to a school that she could kind of develop and compete and have some fun at. And her talent blossomed and grew. And I think in the academic sense, I'm not sure if we do as good of a job of allowing people to like have those multiple paths over the long haul, because we're too obsessed with like the ranking and the sorting and getting into XYZ school to go down a path.
I think that's true. I think that it's just really hard to get right, because the flip side of this is you do away with standardized testing, which a lot of institutions did at the beginning of COVID. And you see this enormous, what's the word I'm looking for? Just like dearth of general aptitude. Derek Thompson just reported on this. The Financial Times has reported on this. Like, people can't do math and they're getting into really good schools because grade inflation is so high, and you can hire a counselor to do your resume for you. So the standardized testing is very imperfect, but it's the one thing that we have that's actually somewhat objective. And then people said, the problem with standardized testing is that it favored some groups but not others. And what I heard, a quote that resonated with me, is that the answer isn't to get rid of the standardized tests. The answer is to get rid of the things that cause the imbalances in groups.
So here's where I think, again, I'm biased, but I think where sport offers, especially track, offers a great example. Because we don't get rid of the races. Like you've run your mile time, you've run your 100-meter time. That's your standardized testing. But what good coaches do, who especially are in that development model, maybe of a Houston versus a Michigan basketball, or a NAU or BYU versus Alabama in running, is what they learn to do is take the standardized test score, the mile time, and then they add context to it. They say, Jimmy might have only run 4:15 in the mile, but he did it in freaking Anchorage, Alaska. So chances are that he is not running 100 miles a week year round, in perfect conditions like Johnny down at the big, great high school cross country program in California. And I don't know how you would do this academically. Someone has to be smarter than me to figure this out. But I think where good coaches do is there's an incentive to find like the hidden gems and the people who are going to have more potential to grow over the long haul and develop because of the nature of sport. And I think that in academics, it's almost like, especially at the elite level, the easiest thing to do is just be like, okay, just take everyone who ran under 4:05 for a mile and it'll sort itself out. And you miss little Jimmy in Anchorage, Alaska, who has the talent and the ability, but because he's racing in snowstorms, he never gets to. And maybe this is, the example of using poverty or school rankings or whatever you have it in academics that kind of give you some of that context.
I think it's also trying to think through this question of how can we create contexts in which we allow for competition that is able to display like who has maybe innate capacity and who doesn't, but also creating contexts that allow talent to like develop or emerge. And like, to use an example, and I don't know if there's a general lesson we can extrapolate from this for other sports or for academics, but something that I was thinking about in prepping for the show was like the Brazilian idea of Jogo Bonito, how they approach playing what we call soccer, what they call football. And Jogo Bonito is like beautiful, is like, I think it translates to beautiful play or the beautiful game or playing beautifully. And the idea is like, you're not just playing soccer to win, you are playing it in a type of way that's graceful and fluid and about balance and rhythm. And they specifically play this game called futsal, which is like you play on a smaller field, you play with a smaller ball. And so it's a smaller space. You sort of have to have better touch, more refined touch. And so it creates this environment where, like, obviously some of those kids are better at futsal than the other kids, but it also creates this like container within which you're cultivating these qualities that allow this sort of fluid, graceful beauty that a lot of Brazilians play with can emerge, right? So it's this really cool union of like, you still have the competitive aspect, but you're also creating this environment that encourages certain emergent capacities to be built into the kids who are playing it. I think that's a really cool idea and like a best practice if you could figure out how to apply that in other domains.
I mean, I love this example because if you can contrast this with the American system, which is essentially get your kids doing like skills and drills from a really young age in football or soccer, is there's a reason we're not as good as Brazil. It's because even though we often start soccer kids young and develop through the academy systems that we have now and all this stuff and get the best coaching, as like, it still doesn't give us that natural grace and beauty of this kind of almost naturalistic experiment that occurs in Brazil. And I think that's kind of the tug, the pull of the rope, the back and forth seesaw of talent development. It's because we think, if we want to develop these kids, then we put them in the intense system. We go to the private school, the intense writing block, the private coaching, blah, blah, blah. and you're going to develop in a certain way. But will you get all the skill sets of going and playing sandlot baseball, of going and playing futsal, of being the creative writer or creative that like experiments in multiple domains and essentially plays? And it's that balance. And I think in the US, because of our propensity towards like ranking and competition, we don't have a lot of those kind of natural competitive environments that like do the development for us. And instead we systematize it. And you can even see this to a degree in the NBA. I know they've had arguments on this, on the resilience of athletes and the kind of natural fluidity of like the AAU developed players versus like the, sometimes better developed European players who have like this naturalness to their game from just like playing instead of, travel teams.
So as we begin to wind down here, maybe we can get a little bit practical or prescriptive to the extent that we ever do that, and give some tools for how people should think through this, right? So if someone's really talented from a young age, I feel like one thing that is maybe helpful to think about, or if you're somebody who has a really talented player or talented kid and you're thinking about how to cultivate it, one thing that jumps out to me, and maybe this is sort of basic or obvious, but like, as you guys already said, you want to sort of make sure that you're applauding them for the work they're putting in, not just their natural ability. I think the other thing is like probably teaching them to like get really good at finding their weaknesses and training those. Because I think if you're good at something, you want to practice the things you're good at, right? But it's really practicing the things that you're bad at. Like it's really going to send you to the next level because you already have this innate capacity.
I think something else that gets overlooked all the time is that kids are not small adults. And so many parents forget this. And I have to remind myself of this all the time. If I was showing a lot of promise at basketball, I would want someone to tell me, you've got what it takes, you could be great, put in the work. I'd find that very inspiring at age almost 40. If I think back to when I was 7.5, someone were to tell me that, I would freak out, okay?
Yeah.
I'd be like, there's so much pressure on me now. What if I don't turn out to be so good? Is dad or mom or coach still gonna like me? It would be terrible. So I also think that your job as the adult is not to tell a young person what you'd want to hear. It's to notch that in the back of your mind and say, oh, so-and-so's got a lot of natural skill at basketball. My job is to keep them interested in basketball. And the worst way to do that is by telling them that they've got all this potential, they're going to be great. The best way to do that is by making basketball fun. And by asking them what you could do to make it more fun. I'm going to pat myself on the back. We're going inside baseball. Steve gives all his college coaching tips and tricks. Here's how the 8U 6-7s are coached. This is true. These are our 3 principles of practice. We do 2 drills every single practice for 25 minutes. That's it. We do a 3-on-2 drill where 3 kids run at 2 coaches and they have 15 seconds to get a shot off. And the whole point is teaching them spacing and find an open person. And the way we say it is we want you guys to turn the coaches around and make us dizzy. Pass that ball so fast that we don't even know where it is. That's drill 1. The second drill we do is a pursuit drill, where one kid starts about 6 yards ahead of the other kid and it's a chase down. And the whole point of this is to get them confident with being able to control their body and try to make a layup when they hear footsteps behind them. The entire second half of practice is just a scrimmage. And then at the end of every practice, we go around and we say, what could we have done to make this more fun? And you'd be surprised at the things that kids say. Sometimes they say, you were calling too many fouls during the scrimmage, just let us play. Other times they say that before I went up for that layup against Lincoln, Coach Zach, you said, here's the 2 big kids, and that made me scared. They're kids. Like, the common feedback is they just want to play. So that's the job when you're talking really young kids. I'll let Steve get to the older kids, but for really young kids, you have to have some kind of compartmentalization in your brain, which is what you as the knowledgeable parent are noticing and picking up versus what's actually going to keep that kid on the path to maybe express that talent fully one day. Don't tell your kid they've got what it takes at age 8. It's not good advice. But you see so many baseball coaches, you see it like on travel teams and not even house league. Like, Johnny, you could pitch in the majors if you just stick with it. first off, no one knows if Johnny's going to pitch in the majors. Johnny hasn't gone through puberty. Johnny's parents are 5'4". Good luck. But second off, like that doesn't help Johnny as an 8-year-old.
Preach, brother Brad. Preach. I have nothing to add on. I think that's spot on. I think the tricky part often comes when you get a little bit older and you're showing some talent. And as a parent, you get excited because you're just like, oh, my kid's good at something and they found something they like and maybe they can go to college or whatever have you. And you have all these dreams in front of you. To me, it's always best to let the kid drive the ship on this stuff. Meaning, if they're motivated, you're going to support them by driving them to practice or taking them to the park or the gym to play basketball. You're not the one suggesting it. You're not the one doing begging them to come. You're just like, look, if little Jimmy or Susie wants to go shoot some hoops and they request you take them there. And I think that's what support looks like. Support doesn't look like I'm going to go and find and interview 15 different private coaches and a shooting coach and a layup coach and all these different things, because all that does is it puts the pressure on the kid, and the message sent is like, oh, mom and dad only care about how I do in basketball or track or what have you. And the way I like to frame it is similar to Brad, is like, think of the message you're sending and think of it as, am I putting more pressure on the kid? Or am I doing my best to support them with the natural pressure that just comes from competing? You want to be the supporter, the person who tries to offload that, who provides solutions when asked. And the other thing, probably the most important part, is just if they're good at something and they're driving the ship, find a good coach. How do you know what a good coach is?
We're taking transfers at the 6-7s. Bring them over.
There you go. Transfers. Brad is building through the portal.
Acquiring talent.
Acquiring
Transfer
talent
portal.
left and right. Build through the portal.
So I think what it is, is you find a good coach. And to me, is like, what is a good coach? It's exactly what Brad said there. Is it's not necessarily their technical X and O's or anything like that. It's like, do they see the point of the sport for what it is at that age level? And do they care about your kid more than just the number to say, oh, I got this kid to college or to championship or what have you? If they care, they're going to figure it out. And I'll use my high school coach was a great high school coach who never coached distance runners in his life until I got there. He was a sprint coach. But what he had is he cared. He said, hey, this guy and his teammates care a lot about being good. They want to run a lot. I'm going to go interview everybody I can who is a good distance coach and figure it out. And we'll go try and figure it out. And that care came through, not only for our performance, but as individuals as well. And I think that's what you're after. You're not after the person selling you, hey, I coach this many D1 athletes and I promise that your kid's gonna get a scholarship, or I promise that they have the ability to go pro. If someone talks to you about that for your 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kid, just run freaking far away. That's it.
I think one other thing to bring in here for someone who's listening and is like, I don't feel like I'm extraordinarily talented at one specific thing and trying to figure out what to do maybe, or how to apply their talents. Another concept I came across while doing research for this episode was this idea of talent stacking and how you can actually combine ordinary talents into an extraordinary combination. So how can you, instead of thinking talent singularly, what am I talented at? Sort of where are my capacities and how could I join them in a unique way that allows me to maybe have a competitive advantage that I may not have if I'm just thinking in terms of singular talents.
I think the notion of talent stacking has a real nice application in knowledge work. This is what business school professors call job crafting. And it essentially means that you're hired for a job, and if you're really savvy and smart, what you can do is you can say, here are the demands of the job, here are my talents, here are the things that I'm moderately good at, very good at, and you kind of take an overlapping view or a Venn diagram and you put all this together and you tweak the job just a little bit to really play towards your strengths. And it might not be the exact job you're hired for, but you're so good at it because you have this unique combination of talents that they end up letting you do it anyways. Versus just being robotic about it and saying, this is the single domain I must try to be great at. You say, well, like I'm pretty good at these 4 things, so how could I put them together? And the emergent property of that could be great. If you're an athlete, you take up triathlon or CrossFit.
You're talking about job crafting. That reminded me of that Japanese concept that has been very buzzy in recent years called ikigai, which is like overlapping Venn diagrams of what you love, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and what you're good at. It's a very similar thing, right? But trying to figure out vocation mixed with passion, mixed with mission, mixed with profession.
Yeah, and then the last thing I'll say to close for everyone, regardless of what you do and whether you're thinking of this for yourself or people that you work with, or maybe your kids or youth that you coach or adults that you coach, is that there's very little satisfaction in just having great genetics. If anything, there's just a lot of pressure and often a lot of misery that comes with being a prodigy and just having great genetics. All the satisfaction comes from getting better. So at the end of the day, this is actually a pretty good thing and pretty empowering, I think, because we don't have control over our genetics. The only thing that we have control over is, are we going to try to get better? And regardless of where we start from, with some work, most people can get very good at most things. And if you've got decent capacity, like we talked about, you can get to the 99 percentile in just about anything. And you get a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment out of doing the work. So if you're really hyper-focused on being world-class at something, then yeah, go do a diagram of those 4 quadrants, figure out where you sit, where your kid sits, whatever, and then do the Jedi mindset trick of just keeping it fun, because that's going to give you the best chance at actually getting really serious down the line. But if you're not trying to be the best in the world at something, and you're not trying to engineer yourself into being the best in the world at something, just remember that like getting better is fun. Mastery is one of 3 core human needs, along with autonomy and belonging. So I think too often we think about the innate and we don't think about the development, even though all the good stuff happens in the development, not the innate.
All right. Well, with that, I feel like it's a wrap on talent. By no means comprehensive, but hopefully this gave you some new and interesting ways to think about talent, and hopefully expanded this binary that I think we often get caught in, that we started the show with, which is nature versus nurture, or talent development versus acquisition. If you have thoughts on what we missed, what you agreed with, where you think we could do better, ideas we didn't cover today that you want to hear us cover in a future episode, let us know. You can email me at clay.growtheq@gmail.com. You can call into our voicemail at 646-893-9503. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, as always, take care of yourselves and be excellent to one another.